The town of Tapalpa sits in the mountains of Jalisco, about 2 hours southwest of Guadalajara. Population around 20,000. Cobblestone streets, pine forests, a church at the center of a colonial plaza. The kind of place that appears in Mexican travel guides as a quiet escape from the city. On the morning of February 22, 2026, it became the location where one of the most consequential law enforcement operations in modern Mexican history concluded with a wounded man bleeding out in a military helicopter somewhere over central Mexico, never reaching the capital alive. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes was dead. The man the world knew as El Mencho, the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the most wanted drug trafficker in Mexico, a man with a $15 million bounty from the United States government and a designation as a foreign terrorist, died from wounds sustained during the military operation before the aircraft carrying him could land. The Mexican Secretary of National Defense confirmed the death publicly on the same Sunday it occurred. Washington acknowledged its role before the day ended. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt issued a statement confirming that the United States had provided intelligence support to the Mexican government for the operation in Tapalpa. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau called Oseguera one of the bloodiest and most ruthless drug kingpins in history and described his death as a significant development for the entire Western Hemisphere. The celebration in both capitals lasted roughly the time it takes smoke to reach altitude, because within hours of the announcement, Mexico was burning. To understand what happened next and why it matters beyond the immediate headlines, you have to understand what El Mencho actually built, where he came from, and why an organization that just lost its founding leader had the capacity to simultaneously destabilize a dozen states in one afternoon. That capacity didn't emerge from nowhere. It was constructed deliberately over decades, through a combination of extreme strategic violence, systematic government corruption, and criminal diversification that transformed a regional coalition into a global trafficking enterprise. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in 1966 in the rural municipality of Aguililla in the Mexican state of Michoacán. Aguililla would later become one of the most contested territories in Mexico's cartel wars, but in the late 1960s, it was simply poor. Subsistence agriculture, avocado farming, limited access to education, and essentially no access to the economic mobility that formal employment generates in more developed regions. He dropped out of primary school, and like hundreds of thousands of young men from similar communities across Mexico and Central America in that era, he crossed the border without documentation into the United States sometime in the 1980s, settling in Northern California. For a period, he worked in construction and agriculture, the informal economy that employs undocumented workers across California's Central Valley and beyond. But the informal economy also includes drug distribution, and at some point in the late 1980s, Oseguera moved into that side of the informal economy. In 1992, U.S. federal authorities arrested him in California on heroin trafficking charges. He was convicted and served time in federal prison. Upon his release, standard procedure applied: deportation back to Mexico. He returned to Michoacán not as the person he left as. He had contacts. He had operational knowledge of how drugs moved north. He had networks on both sides of the border. And he had years of federal prison to consider how the business actually functioned and what he would do differently when he had the opportunity to run it himself. The opportunity came through conflict. Around 2009 and 2010, the criminal organization known as Los Zetas was aggressively expanding its territorial reach across western Mexico. Los Zetas had originated as a group of deserters from Mexico's special forces who brought military discipline and military tactics into organized crime with devastating effect. Their expansion into Jalisco and surrounding states generated violent resistance from local criminal groups and communities that had operated under different arrangements. Several of these groups coalesced under the name Los Mata Zetas, the Zeta Killers, a defensive alliance that fought the expansion and ultimately succeeded in pushing Los Zetas back. Oseguera was part of that coalition and rose through it. After the conflict concluded, the coalition rebranded. They became the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and Oseguera Cervantes became its leader. He was approximately 43 years old. He had a former police background, federal prison experience, 2 decades of trafficking knowledge, and absolute clarity about what kind of organization he intended to build. What followed over the next 15 years was one of the most rapid and sustained expansions of criminal power in Mexican history. The CJNG, under Oseguera's leadership, pursued 5 simultaneous strategies: territorial aggression, moving into states controlled by rival organizations, displacing them through coordinated violence rather than waiting to be challenged; systematic corruption, investing enormous financial resources in buying protection at every level of government, from local traffic police to federal officials to military officers who provided advance warning of operations; deliberate public spectacle, staging acts of extreme violence in visible locations and at visible times, not as loss of control, but as a communication strategy designed to make resistance feel catastrophic before it was attempted; criminal diversification, moving beyond drug trafficking into human smuggling, fuel theft from government pipelines, extortion of legitimate businesses, illegal mining, and any other revenue stream that the organization's territorial control made accessible; and international expansion, building partnerships with cocaine producers in Colombia and Peru, transit networks through Ecuador and Central America, distribution partnerships with criminal organizations in Asia and Europe. Al Jazeera's John Holman, reporting from Mexico City on the day of Oseguera's death, described him as the undisputed head of the CJNG and the most powerful Mexican drug trafficking figure who remained free in the country. The DEA had assessed the CJNG as roughly comparable in power to the Sinaloa cartel, a claim that would have seemed impossible when the organization was founded in 2009. By 2026, with a presence across all 50 U.S. states according to DEA assessments, and operations documented across dozens of countries, the comparison was analytically defensible. Oseguera maintained his position at the top of this structure through extreme personal security discipline. There were essentially no current photographs of him in circulation. He moved constantly, rarely appearing in any location that could be predicted from prior pattern. He communicated through intermediaries rather than directly. He used body doubles in vehicles and at properties where his presence might be anticipated. For years, Mexican and U.S. authorities tracked leads that went cold. The $15 million reward generated information that didn't produce actionable intelligence. He simply wasn't findable through the methods that had worked on other high-value targets. What changed in February 2026 was human intelligence connected to personal relationships. According to Mexican Defense Secretary Ricardo Trevilla Trejo on February 20th, military intelligence tracked the movements of a trusted man connected to one of Oseguera's romantic partners. That associate transported the partner to a rural property in the mountainous area around Tapalpa. The partner met with Oseguera at the location and subsequently left. Oseguera stayed, along with his security detail. Military intelligence confirmed his presence through continued surveillance of the property. They identified vehicles. They established that he remained at the compound rather than departing with the partner. The Joint Interagency Task Force Counter-Cartel, the U.S. military-led intelligence unit that had been operating since January 2026 in coordination with Mexican forces, provided supporting intelligence that the Mexican Defense Ministry described as complementary to their own surveillance. The decision was made to move before the intelligence became stale. Special Forces units were pre-positioned in states adjacent to Jalisco rather than in Jalisco itself, the Defense Secretary explained, specifically to avoid raising suspicion among any CJNG members who might be watching for unusual military movement in the cartel's home territory. On the morning of February 22nd, the ground force moved to Tapalpa. 6 helicopters provided aerial support. The compound at the edge of town, a vacation rental property known locally and notable for having been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department in both 2015 and 2017 for providing material support to cartel trafficking operations, was surrounded before dawn. When the assault began, Oseguera's security team did not surrender. They were equipped with automatic weapons, armored vehicles, and rocket-propelled launchers capable of engaging aircraft. One military helicopter was struck by fire during the operation and forced to make an emergency landing near the town of Sayula. CJNG gunmen engaged the advancing troops with sustained fire through the initial approach to the compound. 4 cartel members were killed in the initial confrontation at the main structure. Oseguera and members of his inner circle broke toward a separate wooded cabin within the complex. A second firefight erupted at that location. When soldiers reached Oseguera, he was wounded along with 2 bodyguards. 3 members of the Mexican armed forces were wounded in the operation. The decision was made to transport the wounded to medical facilities by air. Oseguera, his 2 wounded bodyguards, and a wounded soldier were loaded onto a helicopter. due to security concerns about bringing the operation into Guadalajara in the immediate aftermath of a military action against the CJNG's founding leader. The aircraft was diverted toward Morelia instead. It didn't matter. Oseguera's wounds were fatal. He died during the flight. The 2 bodyguards also died in transit. 8 CJNG members were killed in total in the operation and its immediate aftermath. 2 others were arrested. The seizures at the compound included armored vehicles, rocket launchers, and a significant volume of additional weapons. In Washington, the White House confirmed U.S. intelligence support within hours. In Mexico City, President Claudia Sheinbaum described the operation as the most significant blow against organized crime yet achieved by her administration. The tributes from American officials were immediate and unambiguous, and then the country started burning. The CJNG's response to Oseguera's death was coordinated across geography in a way that demonstrated the organization's real operational capacity. Within hours of the official announcement, suspected cartel members in multiple states began executing pre-established protocols for exactly this kind of scenario. Cargo trucks were hijacked and positioned across major highways. Buses were set ablaze in the middle of intersections. Convenience stores were targeted specifically, the OXXO chain being hit repeatedly across multiple states, burning stores appearing on social media feeds simultaneously from Jalisco, Colima, Michoacán, Nayarit, Guanajuato, Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Nuevo León, and Baja California. By Sunday evening, the Mexican government's own security ministry was reporting 252 roadblocks across the country. At 8 p.m., 23 still hadn't been cleared. Jalisco Governor Pablo Lemus Navarro activated a Code Red, the state's formal emergency security protocol, suspended all public transportation in the state, and urged residents to remain in their homes. Guadalajara, Mexico's second-largest city with approximately 5 million people, became functionally empty. Businesses closed. Streets cleared. The city that is scheduled to host 4 matches of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, including one featuring Mexico's national team before an anticipated audience of 3 million visitors, looked on Sunday night like something between a curfew and a siege. Puerto Vallarta, the Pacific coastal resort city in Jalisco, popular with American and Canadian tourists, entered a different kind of crisis. Roadblocks cut off highway access to the airport. Videos verified by CNN showed smoke rising over multiple neighborhoods. Taxi and rideshare services suspended operations entirely. Hotels locked down, instructing guests to remain in their rooms, away from pools, away from beaches, away from any exposed position outside the buildings. The U.S. Embassy issued shelter-in-place advisories for 9 Mexican states, an extraordinary geographic scope that covered border states, tourist destinations, and major commercial corridors simultaneously. Delta Airlines, Alaska Airlines, American Airlines, Air Canada, and Southwest Airlines all canceled or suspended flights to Puerto Vallarta and Guadalajara. Southwest specifically told CNN it would have no operations at Puerto Vallarta International Airport on Monday given conditions on the ground. Thousands of American and international tourists were functionally stranded, not in danger inside their hotels, but unable to leave. Security analyst David Saucedo, speaking to CNN from Mexico City, described what the coordinated response demonstrated structurally. The main CJNG commanders had united, at least temporarily, to launch a demonstration of force against the Mexican state. The goal was to paralyze economic activity and impose visible costs, nationally and internationally, on the government's decision to go after Oseguera. The operation was not leaderless. Mexican authorities identified the organizer quickly. A senior CJNG figure known as El Tuli, described as Oseguera's most trusted lieutenant and the cartel's primary financial operator, was identified as the person who coordinated the Sunday attacks. He had ordered the roadblocks, directed the arson attacks, and according to Mexican authorities, offered a bounty equivalent to approximately $100 for each member of the Mexican National Guard killed in the aftermath. The bounty worked as an incentive. By Monday, Mexico's Security Secretary Omar Garcia Harfuch confirmed that 25 members of the National Guard had been killed in 6 separate attacks in Jalisco state alone. 25 in 48 hours. A toll that exceeded the military losses from the original raid by a factor of more than 8. Mexican forces located El Tuli on the same Sunday as Oseguera's death. He was in the town of El Grulo, approximately 180 kilometers southwest of Guadalajara. When security forces moved to apprehend him, he attempted to flee and opened fire. They returned fire. El Tuli was killed. In the same 24-hour period, the CJNG had lost its founding leader and its most senior remaining operational commander. Two of the organization's top figures gone within hours of each other. By Monday, Mexican authorities had arrested more than 70 people across 7 states in connection with the violence. More than 70 total deaths were reported across the operation and its immediate aftermath, including cartel members, National Guard personnel, a prison guard, a state prosecutor's agent, and at least one civilian. The overall toll from the operation and the 2 days that followed exceeded 70 confirmed fatalities according to official accounting, though authorities declined to provide details on the circumstances of every death. The question that Mexican security experts were already asking before the smoke cleared was the one that every major cartel disruption forces back onto the table. What comes next for the organization itself? The CJNG, unlike some criminal structures that develop clear succession frameworks, had no obvious heir in a position to actually exercise authority. Oseguera's older brother Abraham, known as Don Rodo, had been involved in the organization's founding and had played a significant role in financial operations. He was arrested by Mexican authorities in February 2025, exactly 1 year before his brother's death, and remained in Mexican custody. His brother is in prison. Oseguera's son Rubén, known within the organization as El Menchito, had been groomed for eventual succession but was arrested and extradited to the United States, where he faced federal drug trafficking charges. His son is in a U.S. federal prison. Oseguera's daughter Jessica was also in U.S. federal custody. The immediate family, every member who had been positioned within the organization's leadership structure, was incarcerated on one side of the border or the other. The closest remaining figure with theoretical authority was Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as El Palón, Oseguera's stepson through his former relationship with Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia. U.S. intelligence had assessed El Palón as the de facto second-in-command at the time of Oseguera's death, but security consultant David Saucedo, analyzing the succession question for CNN, identified the fundamental problem. El Palón held his position because of his family relationship to Oseguera, not because of influence he had independently accumulated among the cartel's regional commanders. In an organization that spans dozens of states and operates in multiple countries, regional commanders, the people who actually control territory and generate revenue, are unlikely to simply transfer loyalty to someone whose authority derives from family connection rather than demonstrated capability. Saucedo described the expected trajectory as a succession war, explicitly comparing it to what followed El Chapo Guzman's removal from the Sinaloa cartel. When Guzman was arrested and eventually extradited to the United States, the Sinaloa organization did not smoothly transfer to unified new leadership. It fractured. Factions formed around different commanders. Violence between those factions killed enormous numbers of people over several years. The infighting is still not fully resolved. A similar internal conflict within the CJNG would mean cartel members fighting other cartel members across the territories the organization controls, which spans communities where ordinary people live and work. Al Jazeera's correspondent in Mexico City noted the absence of any obvious successor directly and observed that the pattern established by previous cartel leadership removals suggested violence would increase rather than decrease as regional commanders competed for control. Chris Dalby, a security analyst who tracked the CJNG's operations closely, offered what may be the most precise characterization of the situation. He noted that the organization retained the capacity to set half the country on fire, even in its current disrupted state. And he made a point about the business logic that is uncomfortable but analytically necessary. The CJNG is a criminal enterprise with infrastructure, supply chains, manufacturing capacity for synthetic drugs, established smuggling corridors, and distribution networks embedded across the United States. Removing the CEO of a functional business does not make the business stop functioning. It creates instability at the leadership level while the operational infrastructure continues. Someone will assume leadership. The timeline and the violence involved in reaching that outcome remain open questions. The regional implications extend well beyond Mexico's borders. The CJNG's operations in Ecuador and Colombia, where the cartel maintained partnerships with local criminal organizations and controlled aspects of cocaine production and maritime export, will not remain static during a Mexican succession conflict. Former Ecuadorian Army Intelligence Chief Mario Pazmiño told CNN that competition over trafficking routes and port control in Ecuador would intensify as rival organizations, particularly the Sinaloa cartel and its operational partners in Ecuador, attempted to reconfigure territorial arrangements and local partnerships that had previously been negotiated with CJNG backing from Mexico. When criminal partnerships built on power relationships lose their anchor, the renegotiation process is violent. The Sinaloa cartel factor deserves specific attention. The two organizations had been competing for years over smuggling routes in central and northern Mexico, for control of border crossings into the United States, and for influence at Pacific ports where cocaine arrived from South America. The CJNG's disruption represents what Sinaloa's commanders will assess as a structural opportunity. The moment to test defenses, probe territorial edges, move into corridors that Jalisco-aligned groups previously controlled, is precisely when the opposing organization is internally disorganized and focused on its own succession conflict. That expansion attempt, if it comes, generates its own violence in communities that become contested ground between two criminal organizations, neither of which treats civilian life as a meaningful constraint on operations. The fundamental strategic debate that Oseguera's death has reopened in both Mexico and the United States is the one that Mexican security policy has cycled through for decades. The kingpin strategy, targeting organizational leadership on the theory that removing leaders collapses organizations, has a track record. That track record is not good. When President Felipe Calderón launched the most aggressive version of this approach between 2006 and 2012, deploying military forces against cartel leadership systematically, the organizations did not collapse. They fragmented into smaller and more numerous groups, became more violent as fragments competed for the territories the dismantled hierarchy had stabilized, and ultimately expanded their combined criminal footprint. The violence during and following the Calderón years killed or disappeared hundreds of thousands of people. The current operation was conducted with U.S. intelligence support, confirmed publicly by the White House, as part of sustained pressure from the Trump administration on the Sheinbaum government to demonstrate measurable results against cartel operations. The political logic is clear. Fentanyl manufactured in Mexico using precursor chemicals sourced from China kills tens of thousands of Americans annually. The Trump administration made cartel disruption a central diplomatic pressure point in U.S.-Mexico relations. Delivering El Mencho's death was the largest single deliverable Sheinbaum's government could produce in response to that pressure. Whether it produces the outcomes the political logic demands is a different question. Chris Dalby's assessment was blunt. Drug flows will continue. The successor to Oseguera, whoever emerges from the internal conflict that analysts unanimously predicted, will inherit an organization that still has production capacity, distribution networks, financial reserves, and customer markets across North America, Europe, and Asia. The precursor chemicals from China that make synthetic drug manufacturing possible are not affected by leadership changes in Jalisco. The demand for fentanyl and methamphetamine in the United States is not affected by what happened in Tapalpa on February 22nd. What is affected is the immediate stability of a country that is 4 months from hosting the FIFA World Cup, with matches scheduled in Guadalajara. The images circulating internationally of burning vehicles, sprinting tourists, and empty streets in Mexico's second-largest city represent exactly the kind of coverage that FIFA sponsors, visiting national teams, and the estimated 3 million expected visitors will be evaluating when they make decisions about travel in the weeks ahead. Analyst David Mora from the International Crisis Group noted that the operation's timing, consequential as it is for Mexican security, arrives at a moment when Guadalajara's international image carries particular weight. Nemesio Rubén Oseguera Cervantes, El Mencho, is gone. The man who built an organization from a defensive coalition in 2009 into what the DEA assessed as potentially Mexico's most powerful criminal enterprise by 2026 died in a military helicopter over central Mexico on a Sunday morning. The operation that produced that outcome required 2 years of sustained U.S.-Mexico intelligence cooperation, surveillance of personal relationships, and precise timing. It was genuinely significant. What it was not was an ending. The CJNG's organizational structure remains functional across the territories it controls, even without the figure who built it. The succession conflict that analysts expect will generate violence affecting communities across multiple states. The rival cartels watching for opportunity will act on what they observe. The drug flows that financed everything Oseguera built will find new management. Mexico's ongoing confrontation with organized crime has lost one of its central protagonists. The confrontation itself continues with the same structural conditions that made him possible in the first place.